Another super pretty song from Eitan Katz off the Unplugged #3 album, the Nigunim, the songs of Shlomo Carlebach. That one's called Mikoilos. Let's light up the darkness. Getting better at remembering. Who is with us on a Wednesday evening? Shandor in the Bronx, Yehuda in South Carolina, John in Maine, Sharon in Lebanon, New Jersey, Pauline in Chicagoland, Renee in Indiana, Melissa in Great Neck, Charles in Omaha, Bella in Florida, Miriam in Colorado, James in Indianapolis, Ryan in Jacksonville, Cecil in Mojave, Paula in Chicago, David in Indiana, Michael, which is to say Mickey, in Vineland, New Jersey, Josette in Colorado, Sam, nice to see you, in Central Virginia. Paula wants us to light up the darkness. Janice in Dallas. Welcome, everybody. Got a really interesting daf today. It's page 35 here in Tractate Kesubos, the 15th volume of the Talmud. Generally, the laws of marriage contracts here in chapter 3, sort of related to the marriage contract, which protects a woman from sort of a summary divorce from the husband. He's going to have to think very carefully about divorcing his wife because, in ancient times, the minimum payment he would have to make was huge, like a year's salary. However, that payment would be even greater if the girl came into the marriage as a virgin than if not. And for that reason, we have some related laws here in chapter 3, and we're still on the first Mishna of chapter 3. We'll finish tomorrow with God's help. What happens when a woman is raped, right? So she's going to be rendered not a virgin. That's going to have an impact when she gets married, in addition to all the emotional trauma, etc. Always remember, we are not this is not a discussion of the law of rape. It's just this one little aspect of that law that the Torah says that one who rapes or seduces a young woman, which is older than a minor and younger than an adult woman, it's at a very discrete stage in life. If one rapes or seduces a woman in that stage of life, he is obligated to marry her, he may never divorce her, and he pays a fine, right? A specific monetary fine. And so then we examine what happens when, that's how this first Mishnah presents of the chapter 3, that, well, what if he can't marry her because it's forbidden to marry her because she is his sister or because she is a mamzer and so she's prohibited to him for marriage or other reasons that get in the way. Then does he still pay the fine even though we can't fulfill the sort of marriage part of that punishment? Answer, yes. And from there, we've gone on to numerous digressions. And the general principle we've been examining is where there is liability for both capital punishment to be executed by either an earthly court or a heavenly court, and at the same time, one becomes liable to pay damages or a fine, and those are different concepts, but at any rate, monetary payment. Do we enforce both? Or if he's whipped, he doesn't pay. And if he pays, he's not whipped. If he gets the death penalty, he doesn't pay. And if he pays, it's because he didn't get the death penalty. Generally speaking, that's the principle. And the sages have had to cast about and look at a lot of nuanced laws in order to derive the source of that principle and some of the exceptions to it. So we continue that discussion. We pick it up at the very bottom of page 34b, where it says, Reish Lakish raised an objection to the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan. Now, Rabbi Yochanan said that in a situation where someone becomes liable to the death penalty, let's say he killed someone, and at the same time he becomes liable to pay damages or a fine, and again, those are different, right? So in the case, for example, of the rape that we're talking about, if you injure the woman, and you're traumatizing her for sure when you commit such a vicious act, So then you become liable for damages for pain and suffering, for loss of work, for medical expenses, for humiliation, etc. Those kinds of damages are all in place in the case of a rape. We're just talking about the fine, which is this particular fine where she happens to be not a minor, not an adult. She's a young woman, so she's still under the authority of her father, and she's raped or seduced. He has to marry her and pay a fine, the fine of 50 shekels. That is separate from the damages for pain and suffering, etc. So sometimes you read, well, if he rapes his sister, he doesn't have to pay the fine. And you're thinking like, well, this is such a horrific act. It's rape and incest. So he's going to get off from paying the fine because it's his sister and not, an unrelated woman. But you have to remember, no, the fine may not apply in that situation for various reasons. But we haven't addressed whether the monetary damages accrue or not. Separate questions, and we have to keep that in mind. Okay, so with Rabbi Yochanan, what he said is that when one becomes liable to pay, becomes liable to either lashes or execution at the hands of the earthly court, and to pay damages or a monetary fine, to pay some kind of monetary damages, some kind of monetary liability, and he becomes liable to both of those things at the same time. And then Rabbi Meir said he pays. Rabbi Meir would even say, yeah, you get executed and you pay. Rabbi Yochanan would say the only time you pay is when we took the corporal or capital punishment off the table. If the lashes cannot be administered or the execution by the court cannot be administered, why? Because the person was not warned that would be the penalty if he committed the crime. And in that situation, we don't apply the death penalty or a whipping. In most cases, not all. So Rabbi Yochanan is saying, if he had been warned that he was going to commit a death penalty offense, and then he committed it anyway, so then he gets the death penalty, and he's exempt from payment. But if he wasn't warned, so then he pays. Right? That's Rabbi Yochanan's take on this. Now, Reish Lakish is going to raise an objection to this opinion of Rabbi Yochanan, and he does so from the following verse, which describes a case where two men are fighting, and during their fight, during their struggle, they injure a pregnant woman, causing her to miscarry. Okay, so she was pregnant, and because they were fighting with each other, they didn't intend to cause harm to the woman. So why is this not just an accident? Because they were engaged in violence against each other. That's why this is a specific case that is different than a simple accident where you happen to hurt another person who happened to be pregnant. Here, it's because they were already engaged in violence with each other, and they injured this woman, I guess this bystander, or perhaps she was the wife of one of them. At any rate, this woman gets injured. She's pregnant and she miscarries. Now, she's injured, so not only is there the danger that she miscarries the baby, she herself could be seriously injured, right? Something that's going to cause the baby to miscarry might well cause real harm to her in addition to what it does to the unborn child. So, the Torah says about this case, when two men are fighting and in their struggle they hurt a pregnant woman and they cause her to miscarry, quote, and yet no harm follow, he shall be punished as imposed upon him by the woman's husband. How can you say, and no harm follow? Her baby miscarried. There was a lot of harm. But what the Torah is saying is, okay, for the unborn child that was caused to miscarry, so for that, there's going to be a penalty. No harm follows means that she herself did not die as a result of this injury, right? So then what happens? Says the Torah, he shall be punished as imposed upon him by the woman's husband. So this suggests monetary damages. Page 35a. Now, says the Gemara, is this not referring to actual harm, meaning that the woman died? And the verse states that he pays only if she did not die. But if she died, he is exempt, even if he was not forewarned. So from this specific case, Reish Lakish is learning out that if you're in a situation where you pay damages, so then you're not liable to the death penalty. And if you're liable to the death penalty, then you don't pay damages. Or here, more specifically, right, he's going to pay for the fetus that miscarried. That's where the fine comes into this, or the monetary liability. But if the woman dies, then this guy becomes subject to the death penalty, and he won't have to pay the damages because he caused harm to the fetus. And that is even if he was not forewarned. And so now what the Gemara is going to do is, so we've got this principle, generally speaking. There's some exceptions, but generally speaking, we're not going to impose a death penalty or a whipping on somebody unless they were warned that if they do the crime, they're going to get executed or they're going to get whipped. So if they weren't warned, they're not going to get that penalty. What the Gemara is going to say is, well, maybe they don't get that penalty because they were not warned, but they are liable to that penalty. They would have got that penalty but for the warning. And because they would have gotten that penalty but for the warning, this must be one of those situations where you're liable to the capital or corporal punishment and not to money. Right? So now they're suggesting, Reish Lakish is suggesting, it's one or the other, either money or, physical punishment. If physical punishment, not money. And it doesn't matter if you don't actually receive the physical punishment because of essentially a technicality, right? You should have got the physical punishment. The crime you committed earned you the physical punishment, and you got off because of this legality that you weren't warned before you committed the crime. So now you're not going to have to pay the money damages either. Sounds like this person is literally getting away with murder, but it's not so simple. Let's continue. And the Gemara answers, no, Reish Lakish. The verse can be explained to mean, if there is no sentence of harm, if the court does not actually sentence him to death, he pays the damages for the miscarried fetus. You can't say that just because he would have been sentenced to death for killing the mother, and he wasn't sentenced to death because he didn't receive the warning, that therefore he's in the physical punishment realm, and therefore he's going to get off scot-free and not even pay the father, this bereft husband who lost his wife and his unborn child on the same day. No, this man is going to have to pay the damages, according to this opinion. He is exempt from payment only if he is actually executed. Now, some say a different version of this exchange. Rabbi Yochanan raised an objection to the opinion of Reish Lakish. And yet no harm follow, he shall be punished, the same verse in the Torah. Is this not referring to a sentence of harm? And the Gemara answers, no. The verse can be explained to mean if there is no actual harm, right? Same idea. Rabbi Yochanan would say, so they're reversing who's saying what. According to this view, Rabbi Yochanan is saying he pays only if there is no actual harm, I guess meaning like he didn't receive the death penalty. If he did receive the death penalty, he doesn't pay. But if he's just subject to the death penalty, but he skated, he's going to pay because he was not actually harmed. We're not going to let him off just because he was in the realm of physical punishment rather than the realm of financial punishment. Rava said, is there anyone who said that those who unwittingly perform the transgression for which one is liable to receive the death penalty are obligated to pay? Right? So if you unwittingly perform a crime that is subject to the death penalty, so you're not going to receive the death penalty, right? Because you certainly didn't act with warning if you did something completely unwittingly. So why would we say, so he's definitely not going to receive the death penalty. Are we now going to say that but it was a death penalty offense if he committed it intentionally, and now that he did it unwittingly, he's going to also be exempt from the damages part, the financial damages? Maybe he did it unwittingly, but maybe we should say it was negligent if it resulted in great harm. And okay, he didn't do it on purpose, but great harm resulted. Somebody is really hurt and needs, the damages payment. Are we going to say he's going to skate? So Rava said, is there anyone who said that those who unwittingly perform the transgression for which one is liable to receive the death penalty, that they are obligated to pay? But didn't the sage of the school of Chizkiah teach, the verse speaks of one who smites a person, and the verse speaks of one who smites an animal. And the two cases are juxtaposed in the verse, Leviticus 24:21, which we're now going to elaborate on. The verse says, "And one who smites an animal shall pay for it, and one who smites a person shall die." Now, elsewhere in the Torah, in various places, it's taught that if you harm somebody's livestock, you have to make it good, whether you did it on purpose or not. And elsewhere, if you murder, you're subject to the death penalty. We don't need this particular verse to learn that. So why did the Torah say in the same verse, one who smites an animal shall pay, one who smites a human shall die, right? Shall get the death penalty. It must be to teach us a principle about the difference between harming someone's animal and harming a human, okay? So what is that difference going to be? Maybe it's that whenever animals are harmed, only financial damages are on the table. And when a human is killed, someone's got to pay. Maybe that death penalty is always going to come. And if the death penalty doesn't come because there's a lack of warning, or some other legal reason that the death penalty won't follow, still we're in that other realm, the realm of physical punishment, not the realm of financial punishment. And therefore, one who would be subject to the death penalty for killing another person, if he doesn't actually receive the death penalty because he wasn't warned or there was some other legal justification for not giving him the death penalty, also is going to be exempt from the payment. That is a view being expressed here. Let's elaborate. Now, just as in the case of one who smites an animal, you didn't distinguish between one who did so unwittingly and one who did so intentionally, between one who acted with intent and one who acted with no intent, between one who smites in the course of a downward motion and one who smites in the course of an upward motion. And why there are these three distinctions, we'll explain in a moment. But in all these cases, whether intentional or unintentional, witting or unwitting, with a downward motion or an upward motion, if you smite an animal, you pay. So just as there was no distinction between, witting or unwitting in the case of smiting an animal, and therefore you pay, maybe there's no distinction between one who smites a human, wittingly or unwittingly, intentionally or unintentionally, with an upward motion or a downward motion. In all those cases, he's liable to the death penalty. Maybe he will receive the death penalty, maybe he won't, but he is not subject to pay money, is what's being suggested, right? Just as the Torah does not distinguish in these cases of smiting an animal, so too in the case of one who smites a person, do not distinguish between one who did so unwittingly and one who did so intentionally, between one who acted with intent or one who acted with no intent, between one who smites in the course of a downward motion and one who smites in the course of an upward motion. In all those cases as well, it is not to obligate him to pay money, but rather to exempt him from paying money. And the law in both cases is unconditional. You smite a person, you smite an animal, you're going to pay. You smite a person, you don't pay. You might get executed, you might get whipped, you might get exiled to a city of refuge, but you don't actually pay money, right? At least not a fine. We'll see. One reason might be, by the way, if it's an adult, an independent adult, right? The person that you hurt is not there to receive the money. That might be a reason why the money's off the table. Now, you would say, well, what about the heirs? What about the dependents? What about the children of somebody who was killed who now are going to starve because their source of income is gone? I mean, there's lots of reasons why this just does not work, right? But that's where we are in the discussion now. And maybe it does work and we just don't understand it yet. So the law in both cases is unconditional. When he smites an animal, he's always liable to pay. And when he smites a person, he is always exempt from payment, regardless of whether or not he is actually executed for his crime. Now, the note on this from Rav Steinsaltz. This exposition, where we had both in the case of one who smites an animal and one who smites a person, 3 types of cases: unwitting or intentional, intent or with no intent, and one who smites with a downward motion and one who smites with an upward motion. What is that all about? This exposition is based on the fact that both parts of the verse, and one who smites an animal shall pay for it, and one who smites a person shall die, as opposed to paying for it. And this verse is superfluous, as the law of causing I already explained that. So here is what they mean by witting or unwitting, etc. So Tosafos explained that these 3 categories, unwitting versus intentional, with intent versus with no intent, and one who smites in the course of the downward motion versus one who smites in the course of an upward motion, they refer to 3 different types of monetary liability. Other commentaries, and Tosafos elsewhere, elaborate on this point. Specifically, they explain that unwitting versus intentional, this relates to, did the person have intention to kill? Generally determined by forewarning. Right? If he was warned, then we know he had intent to kill. With intent versus with no intent refers to one who intended to kill one person and accidentally killed another. He was already committing an act of murder. He just got the wrong victim. That's a different distinction than intentional versus unwitting. This is with intent versus without intent. And in the course of a downward motion versus in the course of an upward motion, this is relevant to exile, right? This is the law of the manslaughterer who didn't intend to commit murder, didn't plot in advance, didn't lie in wait, but either, it was like a crime of passion and heated, they got into a fight and one of them died, or it was purely accidental, but maybe he was negligent, right? And so one of the distinctions that Torah draws is, did he do it with a downward motion? Right? One who ends up killing another person in the course of a downward motion, meaning he dropped something or he swung his axe with intent to hit something, right? And he ended up killing. So there's more culpability there, at least either negligence or some kind of hostile intent, or at least intent. He should have realized that he could do harm when his axe was coming down or when he dropped a big rock off a roof. Versus upward. If he was raising a rock or a piano up toward a roof, this guy clearly had no intent to cause harm, had no reason to think the piano would fall down and drop on a passerby on the street. Or if he was chopping wood, right? If his axe is coming down and it hits something, like, he really should have been careful that there wasn't a person in the path of his axe as he's swinging to chop it. But if it's on an upward motion, he just didn't see that someone was behind him when he took his backswing before, launching the axe into the tree. It's much more accidental, much less culpable. Okay. So rather, when Ravin came from Eretz Yisrael to Babylonia, he said, with regard to those who unwittingly perform the transgression for which one is liable to receive the death penalty, everyone agrees that they are exempt, right? Exempt from the death penalty and exempt from payment. As per the derivation of the sages of the school of Chizkiah, when they disagree, it is with regard to those who unwittingly perform the transgression for which one is liable to receive lashes, and another matter for which he is liable to pay money, right? So if you're going to receive the death penalty, you're definitely exempt from paying money. If you're going to get whipped for your transgression, why shouldn't you pay the money? Right? If you harm somebody, how much does it really help him that you got whipped? Rabbi Yochanan said that he is obligated to pay, as those Rabbi Yochanan said that he is obligated to pay, as those liable to receive the death penalty are juxtaposed to cases of monetary payment and are unconditionally exempt from payment. However, those liable to receive lashes are not juxtaposed. Right? Rabbi Yochanan says one who subject to the death penalty, he's not going to have to pay. But since the law the Torah didn't juxtapose lashes to payment in the same way that it did death penalty to payment, death penalty, okay, you don't have to pay the fine, you're going to die anyway. You're getting whipped, you pay. You pay whatever you owe to the one who was damaged, according to Rabbi Yochanan. Therefore, in the case of one who is liable to receive lashes, unless one is actually flogged, he is obligated to pay for the damage he inflicted. Back to this distinction we're making today, right? You might have thought that if you're subject to the whipping, even if you didn't get it, you're off the hook for paying damages. Now Rabbi Yochanan is going to say, no. If you actually get the whipping, then we're going to exempt you from the damages. But if you're just subject to the whipping, but you didn't actually get it because you weren't warned, for example, then you do pay the damages. Reish Lakish said he is exempt, as the Torah explicitly included those liable to receive lashes like those liable to receive the death penalty and unconditionally exempted them from payment. Right? So says Reish Lakish, you're either in the realm of monetary payment or in the realm of physical punishment. And if you're in the realm of physical punishment, whether you actually get it or not, you're exempt from paying money. So the Gemara asks, where did the Torah include those liable to be flogged? Now, before we go on, why don't we just, say, this is a nice feature of the Koran Talmud, that when we have a discussion that goes, at length like this, and we're wondering, where did the law actually end up? Where did this discussion finally get resolved? Sometimes it's not resolved, even in the course of the debate that we're reading. It gets resolved elsewhere in the Talmud, and we would go on and not know what the law is. So what is the law? If one performed a transgression, punishable by death, and simultaneously performed an action for which he is liable to pay, he is exempt from that payment, even if he sinned unwittingly or with no intent, as per the statement of the sage of the school of Chizkiah. Right? So if you're in the realm of physical punishment, even if you don't get the death penalty, you don't pay the money. That's where it actually ended up. And one who commits a transgression for which he is liable both to be flogged and to pay, he is flogged, and he is exempt from payment. However, if he is not flogged for his transgression, for example, if he performed it unwittingly or without forewarning, then he is obligated to pay. So we see that distinction. If you're in the realm of the death penalty, okay, we're not going to resolve that with this monetary payment. But if you're in the realm of receiving lashes, you get the lashes, then you don't have to pay. But if you don't get the lashes, you do pay. The Gemara asks, where did the Torah include those liable to be flogged? Abaye said it is derived by means of a verbal analogy between the term wicked, that he is wicked and liable to die, Numbers 35:31, and the term wicked in the verse that he is wicked and liable to be flogged. And Rava said it is derived by means of a verbal analogy between the term smites in one verse and the term smites in another verse. And Rav Papa said to Rava, to which term smites are you referring? If we say that it is the verse, and one who smites an animal shall pay for it, and one who smites a person shall die, well, clearly your derivation doesn't make sense because that is written with regard to death. We're talking about whipping right now. Smiting a person in that verse is referring to murder. Rather, it is this term smites to which Rava is referring in Leviticus 24:18. And he who smites an animal shall pay for it, a life for a life. And juxtaposed to it, it is written in verse 24:19, it is written, and a man who places a blemish upon his counterpart, as he has done, so shall be done to him. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, which we've learned elsewhere means money damages, not matching the physical harm. Now the verses like those liable to receive lashes, these verses liken those liable to receive lashes to those obligated to pay money, from which it is derived that those liable to receive lashes are exempt from payment, but the distinction we're drawing today is they only exempt from payment if they actually receive the lashes. If they're liable to receive the lashes, but get off on a technicality, then they do pay the fine, which is different than in the case of the murderer, or the killer, let's say. Now, the Gemara raises a difficulty, but this term that appears in the latter verse places a blemish, which introduces an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. It says places a blemish. It doesn't say smites. How then can one derive a verbal analogy? And the Gemara answers, this is not a verbal analogy based on two identical words found in the identical word found in two different verses. Rather, it is based on identical concepts. So we are saying that it is a verbal analogy between smiting an animal in the first verse and smiting a person in the latter verse. So the Gemara asks, well, however, when the second verse is written, it is written with regard to one who injures another person. And one who injures another person is subject to payment and not lashes. Lashes are not on the table in that situation. This undermines the proof, as lashes are not mentioned in either verse. So the Gemara answers, if it is not a matter of smiting that causes damage equivalent to the value of a peruta, in which case he would pay and not be flogged, then apply it to the matter of smiting that causes damage that is not equivalent to the value of a peruta. Since in that case there is no payment for the injury, one is flogged for striking the blow. Right? If you hurt somebody, you punch them in a way that doesn't cause financially measurable harm, but you're guilty of battery, so you would be whipped for that. Even because you can't compensate the one who received the punch, because there's no monetary damage for it, right? Like the situation would have to be, very specific and carved out so that there would be no kind of financial harm, or at least not measurable financial harm. So therefore, even though you hurt him, the punishment becomes flogging rather than financial compensation. Now we're on page 35b. The Gemara raises a difficulty. Ultimately, one who injured another and is flogged is not subject to payment, as he inflicted damage worth less than a peruta. Why? How do we know the damage was worth less than a peruta, or less than a penny? Because he was flogged. If he damaged another and he was flogged, it must be because there was no financially measurable harm. If there was financially measurable harm, he wouldn't have been flogged. He would have paid the damages. So how then can a principle be derived that one who is liable to receive lashes does not pay even when he is not actually flogged? So the Gemara answers, the juxtaposition of the verses is necessary only with regard to the specific situation where at the same time that he struck the person, right, and hurt them, he also tore his silk, right? So maybe you struck him and you didn't cause him physical, financially measurable damage, but you did rip his clothing. And so you caused damage to his clothing and you owe him money for that. So in that case, where he performed the transgression, for which he is liable to be flogged, the punch to the face, and he is also liable to pay damages because he ripped his silk shirt, it is derived that he would be exempt from paying damages even if he is not actually flogged, which flies in the face of what we have learned so far. The halacha, one who struck another with a blow that causes damage that is not equivalent to the value of a peruta is liable to be flogged, as he is exempt from payment. And the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi. That's just summarizing what we already learned. So in this case of where he ripped the silk at the same time, we're not sure. Rav Chia said to Rava, and according to the derivation of the Tana, the rabbi, the school of Chizkiah, who said, the verse speaks of one who smites a person, and the verse speaks of one who smites an animal. From where does the Tana know that it is written with regard to a weekday? That this is written with regard to a weekday, and therefore there's no reason to distinguish between unwitting and a purposeful sinner. How do we know that? Perhaps we're actually talking about a case that happened where one injured an animal on Shabbat. Right? So on Shabbos, when concerning the animal itself, there is reason to distinguish between one who did so unwittingly and one who did so intentionally. Right? We said in the verse, if you smite an animal, you pay. Doesn't matter whether it was intentional or not intentional. If you smite a person, right, you're not in the realm of payment. You're in the realm of maybe you get the death penalty, maybe you don't. So we assumed that there was no reason to make a distinction between witting or unwitting, right, intentional or unintentional, when we're talking about smiting an animal. Well, now we're going to test that assumption. In the case of an animal that is smitten on Shabbos, whether it was done so intentionally or unintentionally makes a big difference, right? Because now you're not only killing somebody else's animal and you might owe them money for that, but you also desecrated Shabbos. If you did that intentionally, you get the death penalty for it. So now normally we assume that killing an animal cannot result in a death penalty. But if you slaughter an animal on Shabbos, you did so after you were warned not to desecrate Shabbos in that way, now you are liable to the death penalty. So what do we do about this? There is reason to distinguish between one who did so unwittingly and one who did so intentionally. In the case of one who acted unwittingly, he's not liable to receive the death penalty, and he should therefore be obligated to pay because he killed somebody else's animal. Whereas one who acted intentionally, he's exempt from payment because he receives the death penalty for desecrating Shabbos. So if so, we have no source to exempt from payment one who is not actually executed. We can't use that verse. So the Gemara answers, the notion should not enter your mind, as it is written, and one who smites an animal shall pay for it, and one who smites a person shall die. What are the circumstances discussed in this verse? If it is a case where the witnesses did not forewarn him, i.e. when one who smites a person is not forewarned, why should he be executed? There is no corporal punishment, neither lashes nor execution, without forewarning. Rather, it is obvious that they did forewarn him. And if the verse is referring to one who sinned on Shabbat after forewarning, would one who smites an animal be obligated to pay for it? He is executed. In other words, we're only talking about cases where the death penalty applies. So if he executed an animal on Shabbos after a warning, so he did it intentionally, he is subject to the death penalty. And no, he will not pay for the animal, and that is a different case than every other case where you smite an animal intentionally or unintentionally, you have to pay for the animal. New subject. Rav Papa said to Abaye, according to Rabbah, who said, it is a novel element that the Torah innovated with regard to the legal category of a fine. As we said at the beginning of the class, a fine is different than damages, right? Damages is, if you harm a person or if you kill somebody's animal, you're replacing the animal because he's got to replace the animal so that he can, eat it or use it to plow his field, etc. That's actual damages. Even pain and humiliation, medical expenses, loss of livelihood, those are actual damages. A fine is a specific legal penalty imposed by the Torah for certain actions, irrespective of whether you're going to be liable for actual damages or not. It is its own category of financial payment. So the Torah innovated the fine. Okay, what about it? So this novel element in the Torah, the Torah innovated it with regard to the category of the fine, and even though he is executed, he does pay the fine. If the fine is different than damages, and we've been saying one who is executed doesn't pay damages, fine. He doesn't pay damages, but let him be liable to pay the fine if a fine applies in his situation. Now, in accordance with whose opinion does Rabbah establish this Mishnah? If it is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Meir, it is difficult. Why is he exempt if, for example, he raped his daughter? According to Rabbah, Rabbi Meir is of the opinion that even one liable to receive the death penalty pays the fine. If it is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Nehunya ben Hakana, it is difficult. Why does the Mishnah rule that he pays the fine for raping his sister? Rabbi Nehunya holds that one liable to receive kares, that's death at the hands of the heavenly court, is exempt from paying the fine. He might have to pay damages, but not the fine, like those liable to receive the death penalty. If the Mishnah is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yitzhak, who rules that lashes are not administered to those who are liable to receive kares, and therefore they are obligated to pay the fine. However, one who is flogged is exempt from payment, and so it is difficult, as why did the Mishnah rule that he is obligated to pay the fine for raping a woman who is a mamzer, for which he is liable to receive lashes? Now, this works out well if Rabbah holds in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan, who says that one who did not receive forewarning is obligated to pay, even if he performed the transgression for which he is liable to be flogged. He's not going to be flogged because he wasn't warned, so that's when the fine, as well as the damages, kick in. As Rabbi Yochanan can explain the Mishnah as well, in accordance with the opinion, as he can explain the Mishnah in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan, that he's obligated to pay in cases where there's no forewarning. However, if he holds in accordance with the opinion of Reish Lakish, that one who violated a prohibition for which he is liable to be flogged is exempt from payment, even if he was not forewarned and therefore was not flogged, how can we explain the Mishnah? The Mishnah does not correspond to any of these aforementioned opinions. There's a problem with all of them. So where do we get this Mishnah? So the Gemara answers, you must perforce say that he holds in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan in this regard. So Rav Matana said to Abaye, according to Reish Lakish, who said that the Torah explicitly included those who are liable to receive lashes and accorded them legal status like those who are liable to receive the death penalty. Right? And if you're in the realm of corporal punishment, physical punishment, you're out of the realm of paying damages. That's Reish Lakish. Then who is the Tana who disagrees with Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakana and obligates one who is liable to receive kares and be flogged to pay, and the lashes do not exempt him from payment? And the Gemara answers, he holds in accordance with either Rabbi Meir, who says that one who is liable to receive lashes does pay the fine, or Rabbi Yitzchak, who rules that those who are liable to receive kares are not flogged, right? Kares not flogged means you're still in the realm of physical punishment. You might not be punished by the earthly court, but if you have brought upon yourself kares, excision, right? What is death at the hands of the heavenly court? It means you're going to die before your time. Right? Unless maybe later you make an atonement that's going to get you back out of it, maybe. But kares is a very serious penalty. It's just not imposed by an earthly court. So if you're in that, okay, well, you're not going to also get flogged. You're subject to a much stiffer penalty than flogging. So the Gemara turns its attention to a related issue. The sages taught women who are forbidden relatives and secondary forbidden relatives receive neither payment of a fine for rape nor payment of a fine for seduction. Again, we're being very careful. If you rape your sister, right? So now you've raped somebody who's prohibited to you, even if she was willing. So in that case, the payment of the fine for the rapist doesn't apply, right? If you raped your sister. Whereas if you raped, another woman who's prohibited to you for a different reason, you might have to pay the fine even though you cannot marry her. While the fine might not apply because it's a specific Torah law that creates this fine, it doesn't mean that you're off the hook, right? If you hurt her, you're going to owe her all the 5 categories of damages. It's just that the fine may not apply because it's not contemplated by the law that creates the fine to include this kind of a rape. Right? Women who are forbidden relatives and secondary forbidden relatives, they receive neither payment of the fine for rape nor payment of a fine for seduction. Seduction really makes sense because seduction means she participated willingly in this incest. Why should she be rewarded for it? Similarly, a girl who refuses to remain married to her husband, this is a young girl whose father is dead, she's married off by her mother or brothers to an older man, and she's like, you know what? No, not for me. She's married to him, she lives with him, but she's like, I don't want to do this. And she comes back home. She has that right of refusal. But she doesn't get the fine if she's raped, the fine, because it doesn't, or if she's seduced, because once she lived with that man to whom she was married by her family, it's assumed that she's not a virgin, right? That's why this fine doesn't apply. Because she was married, she no longer has the presumptive status of a virgin. What about the Elonis? This is the sexually underdeveloped woman who will never reach puberty, and therefore her legal status is not that of a young woman. She receives neither payment of a fine for rape nor payment of a fine for seduction. And one who leaves her husband due to a bad reputation receives neither payment of a fine for rape nor payment of the fine for seduction. And the Gemara elaborates, what is the meaning of forbidden relatives in this passage? And what is the meaning of secondary forbidden relatives in the context of this baraisa? If we say that forbidden relatives means actual forbidden relatives, this is a short daf today, so we're just going to go a little bit into page 36, tomorrow's page, because it's longer and that'll help us tomorrow. If we say that forbidden relatives means actual forbidden relatives prohibited by Torah law, and secondary relatives means, as it does in most cases, relatives prohibited by rabbinic law, well, that interpretation cannot work in this context because those secondary relatives are suitable for him to marry and are not prohibited by Torah law. Why do they not receive a fine if they are raped or seduced? Rather, the meaning of these terms in this context is different than usual. Forbidden relatives are those for which one is liable to receive a court-imposed, earthly court-imposed death penalty. Secondary relatives are those for which one is liable to receive charis, death at the hands of the heavenly court, which are relatively less severe than those for which one is executed on earth. However, those liable for violating regular prohibitions, like a priest marrying a divorcee, they do receive payment of a fine if they are raped or seduced. And according to whose opinion is this Baraisa taught? It is the opinion of Shimon Hatimni, who exempts from paying a fine only one who rapes a woman with whom betrothal is ineffective. Some say that we can explain that forbidden relatives refers to all relatives with whom relations are forbidden by severe prohibitions, but those for which one is liable to death by the court, and those for which one is liable to karet. And secondary relatives refers to those relatives with whom one who engages in relations with them is liable for violating regular prohibitions. According to this approach, whose opinion does it follow? It is that of Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh, who maintains that even a woman raped by a man forbidden to her by a regular prohibition is not entitled to the fine, despite the fact that betrothal is effective in that case. Again, sort of the fine legal distinctions about whether the rapist comes liable for the particular fine associated with rape, irrespective of whether he becomes liable for the much larger, probably, damages for the harm that he causes her when he rapes her. That's different. Okay. Questions or comments on page 35 here in Tractate Kesubos. Looks like there's only one question. Joseph, the verse about the miscarriage and the quarrel is often used in the abortion debate. Have there been any rabbis who have anything to say about this in particular? Are there any rabbis who have something to say about this in particular? Do you mean rabbis of the Mishnah? Rabbis of the Gemara? The answer is there's hundreds of rabbis who have had something to say about this. It is definitely beyond the scope of our discussion today, right? Today we were just talking about the Torah says you're going to pay damages, because the fetus he caused the woman to miscarry. Didn't say anything about what point in her pregnancy this happens. I will say that under Jewish law, there is a difference between the very early stages of the fetus and later stages of the fetus, but it is completely beyond the scope of today's discussion. Really, what we were talking about there was, what if the mother dies, right? If the mother dies because of this harm, and we have this principle elsewhere that if you negligently hurt a person or intentionally hurt them, not necessarily meaning to kill them, but you punch them in the face, right? And then they fell down and hit their head. So you didn't intend to kill, you intend to just vent your anger on a person by punching them in the face. But then they fell and hit their head, right? So this sounds like some kind of manslaughter, right? Like negligent but unintentional homicide. And one distinction that the Torah makes about that is if this person is confined to their bed and they never get up again, it's your fault. But if they're confined to their bed and then they get up and walk around, and then later they die, then you're not going to have the same level of culpability, and maybe you won't have any culpability. Now, we might say in modern times, whoa. We've seen concussions where the person's walking around, and then later they die, and definitely it was the concussion that caused the death. But those kinds of distinctions, the Torah certainly does account for them. It's a much bigger conversation. It's just a little bit beyond the scope of our discussion here of whether one who is liable to lashes or death penalty also pays damages or the specific fines for certain cases. And finally, Sharon, also the Talmud reference of being permitted to tear a baby limb from limb if it has not yet emerged to save the life of the mother. Right, that's another law from the Talmud that will get brought up when people are analyzing the law of abortions under Jewish law. That you will save the life of the mother. The life of the mother is going to be paramount. for sure. What are the nuances of that? There are many and beyond the scope of today. Okay, so that's what we've got for today. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow for page 36, when we'll finally conclude our discussion of Mishnah number 1 here in chapter 3, God willing, and move on to Mishnah number 2. Have a great night.